Hi guys, this is Arpad in our first episode with actual content after the introduction. Today I'm having a conversation with my friend Pat a bit about the history of a very high level cookery, shall we say. Pat, I mentioned before in episode 1, is the classically trained chef, and I'll let him introduce himself now.
Hi, how are you? As Arpad said, my name is Pat. My full name is Patrick Marr, and I am, much like Arpad, I'm a hobby cook these days, but I am originally a classically trained chef. I went to college 2 years in the UK, where I trained in most forms of food and beverage management, but I tended to specialise in chefing. I worked in the industry for a few years. After that, both in hotel and restaurant and in industrial, worked in hospitals and things. And after a few years decided that a career as a professional chef was not for me. So I gave it up as a career, but I still cook at home. I do a lot of cooking. I've taught several friends to cook, including my wife, and she's turned out to be quite a good cook. So yeah. I tend to be on this team. I tend to be the theory expert, the one with all the knowledge, but not necessarily all the practical.
Cool. What I want to talk about today is, history, shall we say. So, when I look at manuscripts, which is where we get our knowledge about medieval cookery, cooking manuscripts start emerging in the 13th century. This is the oldest ones I know. Before that, we have a massive gap back to Antimus, which is King Theodoric's cook. So, Migration Age. And before that, we have a couple of Roman books. Roman cookery is a very special cookery that has very weird and interesting flavors. Roman cookery uses an ingredient called garum for nearly everything, and instead of salt, and the substitute for that is Thai fish sauce. Antimus still shows traces of Roman influence, but does his own thing. And I wonder whether the 13th century beginning of writing of cooking manuscripts coincides with the Crusades, because what we can clearly see in those manuscripts is the influence of Arab cookery. I have one book that is Sensovi, that is the Catalan early cookbook, where we see a couple of recipes that would appear to be pre-Arab influence, because there's absolutely no spices in them, there's only herbs.
Okay.
But we have and I think what happened was that people went and traveled to distant countries and came back with a taste for what we could argue as being hot food. Very spicy food, as in very, very much spiced, not in very hot. And this of course parallels a similar development in the 18th and 19th century, which is the arrival of curry. Only that in medieval times it became mainstream. As long as you could afford the spices, you cooked with that because it was so good. And
yeah, but that's not mainstream. I mean, that far back, if you could afford the spices, very, very few people could afford the spices. So it remained fairly elitist, I would have said, until you said the 17th, 18th century.
To some extent, yes. I mean, we clearly see with the beginning of the rise of the bourgeoisie, cookbooks arriving that are for the middle class. But I mean, the middle class still is very much a rich class.
Yes.
I mean, the classic one is around 1300. Apparently, the Viandier started arriving as a manuscript, but it became famous with Taillevent, who republished it in 1380. And about 100 years later, the Ménagier de Paris arrives, which is very clearly a household book for the middle class and which very clearly contains the recipes of the Viandier. So as we go, and especially as we go into the 16th century in England, we see cookbooks appear for the middle class. And we know that spices are expensive. On the other hand, we have absolutely no documentation or finds or whatever of the working class and the farmers. We don't know what they ate.
Yeah.
It's a fair assumption that they probably couldn't afford the spices, but we actually have no information. But it is a very complex cuisine with spices, and it's something also to remember that spices, of course, came down the Silk Road and weren't as fresh as what we can get today.
They would have come down the Silk Road, or they would have been shipped directly by in later times by the British East India Company and the Dutch East Indian Companies.
Yes. And I think also the Arabs traded across the Indian Ocean, which probably made that process a bit faster.
Yes.
There is a apocryphal story when Vasco da Gama made it around the Cape of Good Hope and arrived in India and bumped into some Arab traders, fundamentally going, "Hi guys, how are you doing?" And the Arab traders go, "What the bleep are you doing here?" They did not welcome the competition.
No.
Anyway, but that is the high or haute cuisine of the Middle Ages.
Haute cuisine as a term wasn't really coined until the 17th century. I suppose prior to the 17th century, France wasn't really a centre of cooking. Italy was the centre of cooking in Europe. Now we consider traditionally all the best food comes from France. The French are the cooks, etc. That really only started in the 17th century, and it developed out of political and social changes in France. The high cuisine or haute cuisine represented a hierarchy in 17th century France, as only the privileged could eat it. The same as the spices we were talking about earlier. It's still something that only the privileged can eat. It's not necessarily what the working man was eating. And it distinguished itself from regular French cuisine at the time by using foods like tongue and caviar and using stuff that was out of season and exotic and difficult to get. And making it difficult and time-consuming to cook. And that's really where what we call classic cuisine today started. It started with a guy called François-Pierre de la Varenne, a Burgundian by birth. And he was the author of a book called Le Cuisinier François, which was one of the most influential cookbooks of early modern French cuisine. He broke with the Italian traditions that had revolutionized medieval and Renaissance French cookery in the 16th century and early 17th. It's said he started working in the kitchens of Marie de Medici, but there's really no proof of that. By the time he published his first book, the Le Cuisinier François, in 1651, he already had 10 years of experience as the head chef for Nicolas Chalon de Bleu, the Marquis of Ussel, to whom he dedicated the publication and to whom he immortalized in Dussels, the basically chopped mushroom that's cooked into a paste and then used as a filling. He was also known for introducing the first bisque and bechamel sauce. He replaced basically crumbled bread with a roux, butter and flour mix, as the base for most sauces, and replaced lard with butter. And even to this day, classic cuisine is all about the butter.
Which is interesting because one of the things that we see in medieval cookery, and we keep wondering about this, there must have been a revolution in dairy production at some point. in medieval cookery, we see mostly almond milk being used. And this is not necessarily a function of Lent when you can't consume milk or dairy products, or fast days. This seems to be a question of availability. You see butter very occasionally used. You see cheese occasionally mentioned. Fresh milk, in a later recipe I found the quote, and you can use fresh milk instead of the almond milk, or fresh sweet milk if you have it.
I suppose it's almost a reversal of the elite having the only access to the spices. The working class, the farmers, were the only ones with the access to fresh milk. There was no refrigeration. There was no way to keep milk. Milk would go off very quickly, so it wouldn't get to the high tables as often as it would get to the farmer's table.
Oh, absolutely, good point. And that definitely explains the fresh milk, unless you are somewhere out in Newcastle where you have the cows grazing outside. But butter travels reasonably well, especially salted butter. So I think there must have been, at some point, something must have happened that increased dairy production, and I still don't know what it is.
No. Refrigeration. The ability to preserve milk long enough. Pasteurization.
Well, that is one part, but again, even if you'd had it available in your country estate, let's not forget people lived in the country, it would have been mentioned. And butter travels. Butter is a way of preserving milk in a way, as is cheese.
Cheese, yeah. Cheese will last a lot longer than butter will.
But butter will also last longer than fresh milk.
It will last longer than fresh milk, but not as long as cheese lasts. I mean, so sometimes when people were laying down stuff for preservation, they were preserving it for months. Butter couldn't preserve milk for months. It would preserve... cheese can.
Yes.
Butter can't.
Yes. But as I said, there is a conversation about what happened, why is dairy all of a sudden becoming so much more available. And refrigeration is much later. I mean, at some point, yes, they start cutting ice in the Alps and shipping it, but even that is 18th century, I think.
Sure, yeah.
So, well, the mention happens earlier, so we think something happened with the cows giving more milk or whatever. Somebody started breeding a cow that could give more milk, but that's only a hypothesis.
Possible that by the 1600s, they must have had something, because, as I said, Varane started replacing lard with butter. So butter must have been available to him.
Exactly. And we see that a little bit earlier, but I mean, if I go Martino, and the beginning of this channel will all be about Maestro Martino da Como from 1540. No, sorry, earlier, 1480. And I have a couple of recipes where he uses milk, and that's custards.
Yes.
So he could get milk, and you can't use anything. You can't use almond milk in a custard.
No.
But that's the only ones. Nowhere else. You don't see cream used. He doesn't use butter really. He uses lard because it's Northern Italian. I'm gonna substitute that a lot with olive oil because for modern sensibilities, and I can re-argue it because in Southern Italy they do use olive oil instead of lard. But you really don't see milk. But anyway, the other thing that's interesting is that with the 17th century and the arrival of Baroque, we also see a move away from the highly complex use of spices down to very simple things. And in the beginning, I thought this was a very plain shift, which of course it isn't. I've had a look at 17th century cookbooks, and you distinctly still see in some recipes the medieval use of spices. In others, you see it fundamentally gone, where you use one or two spices, that spice quite often being pepper, and one or two herbs. And that is it. Very simple. And that is in royal cookery. I have an apocryphal quote that I can't attribute about this medieval spicing. But again, it's apocryphal. I have no source for it. It may be an invention after the fact. I don't know. But it seems to hit the mood a bit. And we see something, my wife and I've done a bit of work on that yesterday about kitchen pepper, which looks very much like a spice mix that is kind of your universal kitchen spice. A lot of kitchen peppers contain salt.
Yes.
Yes. And that looks like they have descended from poudre fort.
Yes.
We don't have enough early sources. The oldest one I could find was 1682. My wife is of the opinion that it may have been a parallel development. She's not convinced otherwise, and my wife is a scholar, so I have to be careful with my hypothesizing. I'm more of the opinion that I think it got kept in the middle class, in the lower classes, and got simply survived for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, kitchen pepper, I think, was basically a seasonings and spices version of mixed herbs. I mean, everyone's got their definition of what goes into mixed herbs.
Yes, I think that is very much the case. The question is it an unbroken tradition or not? I would like to think it is, but that rests on somewhat shaky shoulders, because it's like also when we move a bit further in the history to, was it de la Varenne? The gentleman who started off as a pâtissier.
Marie Antoinette Carême.
Yes.
Marie Antoine Carême. It's curious you should mention Carême. Carême was the second of what is considered the three great chefs of haute cuisine, Varenne being the first. Born in 1784, so late 18th century. Worked as a kitchen boy in a Parisian chop house for bed and board, and was then apprenticed to the famous pâtissier Sylvain Bailly. He gained quite a reputation in Paris for his pièces montées, elaborate centerpieces that would be basically elaborate centerpieces for the center of large tables. It's not something you see very often. At least it's not something I've ever seen actually served as a meal, but I did see it effectively being done at the Hotel Olympia exhibition back when I was in college, and they had a room there called the Salon a room called the Salon Culinaire, which was basically just a room of set pieces that had been built out of sugar or out of ice or out of pastry, out of white fat, and it was the kind of thing you just walked straight through without stopping. Well, walk slowly. It was like walking into the Crown Jewels in the Tower of London. Roped off walkway that you followed and looked at all of the lovely little pieces, but you weren't allowed to touch any of them. But that is literally the only thing I've seen in as pièce montée since I was at college. But it was what Carême made his name as. He did freelance work creating these pièces montées, principally for the French diplomat and gourmand Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord. Please excuse my French pronunciation; it is quite bad. Talleyrand challenged him to create a whole year's worth of menus without repetition and using only seasonal produce. He managed this, and that basically completed his training moving from pastry into sort of mainstream non-pastry cooking. He travelled around a lot. He worked for a lot of people. He was chef de cuisine to the Prince Regent of the UK, later George IV, and to the banker James Mayer Rothschild.
Now, those pièces montées are quite interesting. And what I would like to know, actually, were those for consumption or were they just for display?
I think mostly they were just for display.
In that case, I'm gonna postulate that these are quite possibly a follow-on from what in the Middle Ages was called a subtlety.
Okay.
Which is exactly that. It's anything but subtle. And I don't know where the name comes from. It might be the Little John tradition of naming things. But I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because they were elaborate display pieces made out of dough or whatever. I never really have traveled in that direction myself. I'm interested in flavor, not in show. But they are clearly documented in a lot of manuscripts. And in some cases, yes, there were fancy things done that were for consumption. Serve a roast peacock in its own plumage.
Yeah.
And I know somebody who did that for their wedding. Verdict was, it's not worth the effort. But I'm interested. The thing that I came across in all of this recently was that a year ago, if you'd asked me, well, there was medieval cookery with Arab influence, then there was a rollback to basics in the Baroque, and a different way of complicating things, clearly, which I wasn't aware that this tradition of the haute cuisine goes back that far. And instead, it looks to me like we have a tradition that at the highest level slowly gets broken into more simple things. And of course, I haven't looked at the French cookbooks. I've looked at the English ones where you clearly have. I have a small cookbook by the National Trust about Stuart cookery, where you clearly see both the medieval influenced recipes, albeit with more citrus. Clearly citrus somehow managed to get transported better.
Citrus,
okay. Of all things, yes. Lemons all of a sudden show up a lot more in English cookery rather than in Italian, where I see them anyway. And there's some recipes that are very simple and elegant, but you do see a lot of very traditional medieval spicing with ginger and cinnamon and cloves. And nutmeg.
You don't see much spicing in haute cuisine, except around Christmas dishes. And then it's your sweet spices, your mace, nutmeg, cinnamon, etc. You see some herbage, like using tarragon in a holiday sauce, or using basil with tomatoes in a tomato salad. But you don't see much in the way of spices beyond salt and pepper.
Okay, so that would be interesting to see. I mean, at some point we will have to look at that first cookbook and see what's in there, whether there are still spices in there or whether that already had been rolled back to fundamentally salt and pepper. And maybe nutmeg in a bechamel or something like that. But overall, I'm noted, I mean, as always, when you look at something closer, things are more complicated than you had assumed. Beforehand, I mentioned curry. And when curry arrived as a dish in England, it didn't take over English cuisine. English cuisine remained what it was, but it added nearly a separate tract of cooking in England.
Oh, yes. Oh, curry's very big in England.
Yeah, the Anglo-Indian cooking tradition.
Yeah, it would never be considered as traditional English cookery, but it is very commonplace, very mainstream, and there's even curry dishes that are exclusively English, that were invented and came about after sort of curry made the jump from India and other places around India to the UK. Which is the most famous one now? Balti. Balti curry is completely English invented. Now, it's invented in England by Indians, but it doesn't exist in well, it didn't exist in India, and suppose it's gone back. Kind of like things like pizza. Now, there are two stories about pizza, but one of them is it was invented in America by Italian expatriates, and then went back to Italy because Roman pizza is possibly the finest in the world. But there is a theory that says that pizza was invented outside of Italy by expatriate Italians, in the same way the Balti curry was invented by expatriate Indians living in the UK. Birmingham, I believe, or maybe Bradford, but I think Birmingham. And then obviously it's gone back to India.
I recently looked up fat curry, which is, for those who don't know it, for people who find Vindaloo way too mild. And that was invented in Birmingham.
God, that doesn't surprise me. I actually, curiously enough, only ever heard of fat curry very recently. Like last New Year.
Wow.
I went to an Indian. I was in Tenerife for New Year with my family, and we went to an Indian restaurant. It's a very nice Indian restaurant, beautiful food, bad service. Like, you could wait 40 minutes for the waiter to come over and see you. But when the food arrived, it was delicious. And everything they had various levels of hotness, of which fat was the highest. So it's like mild, medium, hot Vindaloo fat. And I discovered by accident that not all curries that you would order as a mild would be the same.
Oh, yeah.
It was based on the curry itself. So whatever way the curry is normally served, that's a medium. So a medium Rogan Josh is going to be hotter than a medium korma. And you adjust just as appropriate. Unfortunately, I went for a hot, so mild, medium, hot, or whatever the next one is, sort of level 3 on a chili tikka masala, thinking that medium would not be hot enough, to discover that if I'd ordered the medium, it would have been a chili tikka masala. By ordering the hot one, I ordered a very hot curry, because chili tikka masala is hot to start with.
Ouch.
I think I had a korma the next day.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. But what I found also interesting in this whole cycle is we see in spicing or in complexity, you tend to see a bit of a move back and forth. You have the complex medieval seasoning, then you have the move to, as Gordon Ramsay said, let the ingredients speak for themselves. And then that gets complicated again and simplified again. I mean, Nouvelle Cuisine, which until recently I thought had been invented by Paul Bocuse, very much simplifies things. Whereas if you look at Cuisine Classique, things are maybe not more complicatedly spiced, but I think more complicatedly prepared.
Definitely complicatedly prepared, not complicatedly spiced. And Paul Bocuse was only one of the people that is responsible for Nouvelle Cuisine. There was a whole gang of them. I can't remember who else it was, but I know Bocuse was only one of them. And it came about, the word I think came about from Concords Maiden Flight. I think a bunch of them were working on the food for Concords Maiden Flight, and some reporter called it Nouvelle Cuisine. And I really hate Nouvelle Cuisine. It's so much work for very little portion. I like big portions and I don't want to say simple flavors. I like complex flavors, but I like large complex flavors.
Yeah.
I don't expect to eat something that's, you know, really, really small and there be lots of different little flavors in it. I like my meat with a sauce and my vegetables, and they can be different flavors, but I like larger portions, I suppose.
Now, one can make exceptions. We tried a tasting menu at Patrick Guibault a while ago, which I found was stunning, and contrary to my expectation for this kind of thing, we didn't have to go to the chipper afterwards to fill ourselves up.
No, we didn't, but then we had the tasting menu and we had, 8 courses?
Yeah.
So, whilst each dish was very small, they were all gorgeous, and I even ate caviar for the first time since I was in college. Because we ate 8 courses of it, it was filling. 3 courses of precisely that, and you'd be going to the chipper afterwards.
Yes.
Even 4 courses of precisely that, and you'd be going to the chipper afterwards.
I think what really filled us up was those 2 desserts.
Oh, the desserts were gorgeous, weren't they?
Weren't they ever? But yes, in general, as a once-in-a-lifetime experience or once-in-10 years experience, that kind of thing I find cool and lovely, and it taught me a lot, and it was a brilliant experience and a lovely evening.
Oh, it was. And thank you for bringing me.
No worries, it was my pleasure. But I've watched MasterChef Professional, and there was one cook I was rooting for who was from the Caribbean and was using Caribbean influences. But he got too complicated. I don't want to have 23 different flavors on my plate, and especially I don't want to have to sit down and figure out how to construct my fork in such a way that it is pleasing. I was at a restaurant for my brother's stag party, and that was good food, but it was cooked in such a way that out of the whole dinner I had one perfect fork, because I actually had to think what I had to put onto the fork with something else. And
yeah,
I am not a fan of this. This is the cook's job, not the eater's job.
Yes. I expect there to be 2 or 3 flavors on my plate, and I expect them all to work with each other.
Yes. On their own, mind you. One memory from that evening is Radu, who's cutting these videos, sitting there with a spoon eating all the pomme puree that we had been served. So yeah, development of food. One of the themes I'm seeing is it gets complicated, then somebody goes, this is too complicated, I don't like this, let's do back to the roots. And then people come up with other ways of making it complicated again, and somebody goes, no, simple, I said. And then the wheel turns again.
The wheel will always turn. I think Hood Cuisine was simple flavors, but it was difficult to prepare, and back in the very early parts of it, it used what were then exotic ingredients, seasonal fruits and stuff that weren't necessarily available all year round. But it also codified cooking a lot and started putting down techniques and standard recipes. I mean, one of the things that Carame did was he worked a lot on codifying sauces. So he was one of the first people who started using several base sauces from which to create other sauces. I mean, I said earlier that Varane invented bechamel, but it was Carame that classified everything into either a bechamel, a veloute, an allemande, or an espagnole. Now, when I was in college, bechamel, veloute, and espagnole were still being used. Allemande wasn't. Bechamel is the classic white sauce. It's just a very light roux with milk. Veloute is slightly darker. You cook the roux for slightly longer, and you mix it with a light stock, vegetable, fish, something like that, chicken. And it produces a light sauce for things like lamb d'agneau and chicken fricassee. And then an espagnole is a much darker sauce, which is the basis of gravies. The allemande was a light coloured veloute, so I suppose it came somewhere between a veloute and a bechamel for colour, and was then thickened with egg yolks and heavy cream and seasoned with lemon. It was also known as sauce parisienne. And Carame codified that and basically laid out that just about every sauce comes from one of them. I mean, you take a bechamel sauce and you add cheese to it, and you've got a Mornay sauce. You can add chopped egg to it, you can add anchovies to it, you can add mushrooms to it, and these are all different sauces. And it's the same with veloute. A lot of stews or casseroles would have a veloute or an espagnole base, and then other things added to make what is distinctively whatever the dish is you're making, like chicken fricassee or a lamb d'agneau.
I mean, which is interesting because medieval sauces are completely different. In one of the upcoming episodes, I'm making a Chameleon sauce. And we'll talk a little bit more about that then. Because medieval sauces, as you pointed out, they're thickened with bread. And they very much stand by themselves. But let's go into that in the other episode.
Sure.
But yes, I think we've outlined the history a little bit and where you can expect medieval cookery to sit compared to what we know. Anyway, thanks guys. I've been Arpad.
And I've been Pat.
And if you like what you see, hit the like button. And if you want to see more of this, hit subscribe. And if you want to be notified when it happens, ring the bell. Cheers guys. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.